Alrighty, back again. Excellent. Sort of following along from that previous lecture on correlations, once again, I'm going to kind of talk to you about experiments in my own way so that you can kind of bring together what you learned from in the textbook with what I tell you. We're going to talk about a lot of the same things once again, but again, this is an important issue that I want you to really understand. I'll probably frame it a little differently than the textbook will every now and then, and so that's why I want to give it a go to. And in some cases, it's good to hear it from two different sources to really kind of get it straight in your mind. So where are we? Well, we've kind of talked about naturalistic observation first as just, an opportunity to kind of observe and see things that you might think is going on. I find this sort of a useful way to think about it sometimes. The suggestion here is you could then do a correlation kind of study to see that kind of confirms your observation, right? So naturalistic observation is like, I kind of think there's a connection between one's social status and their behavior in terms of whether they defer to the eye gaze or not. It seems like that. Well, what correlation allows you to do is to establish, yes, that's actually true. There is something going on. So they call that the what of the question, so to speak. There is an association, a relationship between those two things. That's what correlation can tell you. It doesn't tell you how that association came about or why you're seeing it. So this is where we get into causation. So it's kind of interesting from a philosophical perspective, and actually I should say a psychological perspective as well. There's a lot of discussion that suggests that we humans are really looking for causation, and we find it all the time, often inaccurately. Even silly things like, you're waiting in an elevator, so you click the button, you're waiting in an elevator, and nothing happens. How often do you click the button again, even though it's lit up? Most people do it again in a little while. Why? Because on some past occasion, they've pressed the button and it lit up, but the elevator didn't come, and then they pressed it again and it came. And they want to say, oh, it's that second press that made the elevator come. They know it's not true. They know it's the first press that commands the elevator. But when they do something and something else happens right after it, for most of us, we're very quick to infer that the first thing caused the second thing. It's like our brain is constantly looking for these causal relationships. Why? Because they help us predict the future. And we like to be able to predict the future. We like to think, hey, if I do this, then that's going to happen. And the more accurate we are at predicting the future, how things will unfold, the more comfortable we kind of feel. So we're always looking for these causal relationships, and we're very quick to accept them even when they're not true. So that's why with the correlation thing, I had that whole, don't be tempted into a causal story, because correlations just don't tell you that. They only tell you two things are related. What if you really want to know the causal relationship? And since about, John Locke and others, when the empiricists really began, and especially after this group called the Vienna Circle, which were a group of philosophers and scientists who got together and really wanted to establish a formal approach for figuring out causal relationships. Like, how can we really know if something causes something else? And this Vienna Circle ended up formalizing something we now call the scientific method, and also, really push the development of a lot of the statistics we use in combination with the scientific method to reach conclusions. And so they formalized a lot of how science happens. And that's what we're going to talk about now, experiments being core to that formalization. Okay, get at this causation, the how and the why. Here is the scientific method, and you've seen this before, but now we're really going to kind of get into it a little bit more. This allows us to connect some of the things you've been learning, making observations. That's classic observational learning or participant observation. Sometimes it's like surveys too, right? Surveys are another way of observing. It's your way of getting into somebody's mind by asking them things, so you can kind of observe there. Based on what you see, you can sort of formulate some interesting questions. Maybe even it doesn't say it here, but we're going to start bringing up this issue of theory. You might even start formalizing a theory. And let me make, well, we can bounce around on this distinction a little bit, but the theory we're going to have this dance between the theory, I'm going to stick that up here, and the hypothesis. And I'm going to talk about it more. What's the difference between those? A theory is a bigger idea you start to develop, and it tends to be big and kind of general, okay? And a hypothesis tends to be a much more specific prediction that you can derive from that general theory. And so often we have observations and they get us thinking, oh, I think I understand what's going on here. I think I see how these things are connected. That is, we can see these sort of causal relationships between things happening. That becomes our theory. And we then say, well, if that theory's right, then, and here we have a hypothesis. If I looked at this specific thing, I'm pretty sure this is what we're going to see that's going to happen. And so we end up with a very clear prediction here from our hypothesis. We develop this testable prediction, and then we do the experiment. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about this sort of step here. What do we mean, do the experiment? Because there is a skill to creating a proper experiment. There are a whole lot of potential pitfalls, a whole lot of bunch of things you can do wrong that you have to be on the watch out for. So we'll talk about some of that. But that's ultimately the experiment gives us the data, right? And it's not shown in here somewhere, but somewhere around here would be doing stats on the data to reach a conclusion related to your prediction. Was your prediction held up or not? And then what it's kind of applying here is if it was held up, that supports your theory, at least in terms of that specific prediction. Maybe you can make other predictions, etc. And so you can continue to develop the theory into a more general one. If the prediction didn't hold up, then we get into this notion where either our theory is wrong or the prediction we derived was wrong. Something needs to be changed, something needs to be refined, or maybe we just throw it out. Maybe we just say that was wrong. But we have to make some decision in that case about how to go on next. Okay, if we do just alter our theory, then we might end up with different predictions that come from it, and we can test those, etc. Okay. So we're going to live a little bit. We've kind of lived up here. We've talked about that. Interesting questions. The correlations kind of suggest interesting questions. Does coffee really keep you alive longer? That's what the correlation seems to imply. Well, could we actually test that in a much more specific way that allowed us to literally know if coffee has that causal effect or not? Then we're into the experiments here. Okay. So let's do this a little bit. Concreteness always helps. So here is a claim, and this claim is not a new claim, by the way. It's a bit of a depressing claim. I have to say that when I grew up, I used to think, I heard about a lot of the racial tensions in America in the 1960s, and I used to think, and before, obviously, and I used to think that was an older, stupider version of humanity that was so prejudiced. And I felt like we had learned and we had grown and we weren't that stupid anymore. And so I always felt like prejudice was an old thing that was getting better and better and better and better all the time, as we all got a little bit more enlightened about, racial equality and all these kinds of things. And then in the 80s, the race riots kind of hit when the economy... was it the 80s? I don't know. But at some point, the race riots started to creep in, and that told me that, hey, maybe prejudice isn't something that just gets better and better and better. Maybe it kind of, at times people are more prejudicial, and at other times they're less prejudicial. Maybe it kind of, comes and goes, which was depressing for me because I thought it was just going. Might it actually come back? Some form of real racial tension. I mean, we have a lot of it today, right? And that's when I was told about things like, well, hey, World War II, a lot of the story there is that Germany was going through some really tough economic times. And the story people tell is if you are a German, and especially a German who's lived in Germany for generations, and now suddenly you get fired and you can't provide for your family, that you feel really crappy, you feel horrible, you feel angry, and you want to be angry at somebody. Who will you be angry at? Well, the easiest people to be angry at are people that are different from us. We're going to call that an outgroup in some way. People who in some manner are different from us, and often racial and cultural differences are the most obvious, and therefore the easiest to kind of use. And so the claim is, in Germany, suddenly the Jewish people who, still maybe held jobs. So imagine, you were a multi-generational German, and down the road there is this new immigrant Jewish family that is doing okay, even though you just got fired. And so that can be a recipe for you saying it's their fault. It's their fault they have fired. They've taken good jobs. They've ruined our country. They're not real Germans, yada, 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 right? All that kind of story. So this notion has been out there for a long time, and the story kind of goes like this. When you have an economic downturn, bad things happen to majority people, majority races, culture, whatever, and that makes them feel lower self-esteem. They feel like failures. They feel like they're not doing well, and that makes them kind of angry, and that makes them prejudiced. Okay, so the low self-esteem, ultimately, the lowering of their self-esteem ultimately creates an increase in prejudicial behavior. Okay, so this is all a story based on observation, historical observation, etc. What if we wanted to really test this idea experimentally? So let's jump into that. So first of all, theory versus, I'm not actually going to rap for you. There's one thing I don't do. It's rap. I do rock out. I have a band, but I don't rap. I know better. But I thought this was a cool picture. It is a chance to talk about these different things. And let me just put them both down here. A theory. So in this context, the theory would be something like this. People become more scared of others when they're feeling personally weak or insecure. So when their self-esteem is low, when they lose their job, whatever, I say here more scared, but maybe I should have just said more prejudicial of others, okay? Because it's not really clear that they're scared of these people. It's more that they're angry with them. They're choosing them as a target for their frustration, so to speak. Okay, so let's say that's the theory. Now notice that's kind of a big thing, right? And it kind of says, hey, anytime you're feeling weak for any reason, you might be more likely to be prejudicial towards some other person who's different from you in some way. Big. We want to get to an experiment. And so our first step is to go from that big theory to a much more specific hypothesis that's connected to that theory. And so here's a more specific one. People with lower self-esteem should behave in more prejudicial ways than those with higher self-esteem. That follows from the theory, but it's become more specific now, right? We're focusing on self-esteem, low versus high, and we're focusing on prejudicial kind of behavior. And so this starts to sound like something we can test. Now, at this point, let me say, we could do a correlation study, just so you see how this all weaves together. We could literally ask people, somehow, we could measure people's self-esteem. There are questionnaires for that. So we could ask them to fill out a questionnaire that gives us a sense of their feeling of self-worth, their self-esteem. How do you measure prejudice? That's tricky. Let me for a moment pretend that you could just ask them how prejudicial they were, that there was some survey they would fill out that would ultimately measure their level of prejudice that they exert on others. Already you see a problem, probably. People are not going to be honest on those surveys, right? Here's the subjective measure problem again. There is something called social desirability norms. People know the right answer, and the right answer is I'm not prejudiced. But that's not actually the accurate answer quite often. So how could you measure it? Let's put that aside for a moment. Although let me say there's some really interesting research on that. I'll come back to it. I'll let you know some of the other ideas. But if you could measure, if you could for every person know what their self-esteem was and what their level of prejudice was, then you could see if the two are correlated, right? And what would we expect, by the way? A negative or a positive correlation? People with lower self-esteem should be more prejudicial. What is that? It's a negative correlation. Anytime the two move in a different direction, it's a negative correlation. So as self-esteem gets lower, prejudice gets higher, is what we expect. So we might do that study, and we might find, yep, there's a significant negative correlation. That says those two are connected in some way. But maybe when you're a prejudiced jerk, some people don't like you, and that somehow makes you feel not as valuable. So it could be your prejudice leading to a lower self-esteem. Or is it your low self-esteem that leads to prejudice? Or is there a third variable that's causing them both to do this? Again, with correlations, you just don't know. We have to do an experiment. Our experiment is going to focus on the role of self-esteem to cause or not prejudicial behavior. Let's jump into it. Right. Blah, 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 blah. So I already said all this stuff. I just didn't say it with this slide. Here's the experiment. Okay. So this is one that was done, by the way. And I like it because it allows us to highlight a number of different issues. But let me just kind of give you a sense to begin with. So we start with a bunch of normal people. Who knows what normal is? There is no real such thing as normal, but whatever, a bunch of average people in some way. And we're going to randomly assign half of them to we'll call this, your textbook, this is a good chance. Your textbook likes to say you have an experimental group and you have a control group. And the usual option is the control group you don't really do anything important to or with, but the experimental group, you manipulate something that you think is important. And so you want to see if that group behaves differently than the control group. So quite often we have that, but sometimes we have two groups where it's hard to say which is the control. We just know these groups differ in some important way. So let's say we had a way of making people's self-esteem high or low. I'll come back to that. But let's say we had a way. So then what we would love to do is start with these people, and for half of them, in a random half, I'll explain that in a moment, but for half of them, we increase their self-esteem. For the other half, we reduce their self-esteem. And so now we have two groups, a group that we've created to have high self-esteem and a group that we've created to have low self-esteem. Otherwise, they should be identical. And now we want to measure the prejudice. And we want to say, does this low group show more evidence of prejudice than the high group? Okay. This is a nice experimental contrast. Now, if the answer is yes, if the low group shows more prejudice, then we can be pretty sure that it's their low self-esteem that's causing that. So we have a good causal sort of study because we've manipulated self-esteem. And so if it makes a difference, then we know that's what's causing the difference. Okay, cool. I think you have it in a general sense. Let's just explore some issues around this experiment. First of all, I've highlighted random selection. When you're putting people into two different groups, the best way, generally, is to say, okay, you're the first two people. I'm going to flip a coin. Heads, you're in that group and you're in the other group. And literally to randomly put people in those two groups. The randomness, if it's done right, and if you have enough people, so let's say we originally had 100 people and 50 are going to this group and 50 are going to that group, and we just randomly pick which 50 go here and which 50 go there. If we're randomly picking, we should not create any systematic difference between these two groups. That is, we shouldn't end up with more males in one of the groups. We shouldn't end up with more tall people in one of the groups. We shouldn't end up with more people that slept better the night before, or that eat better, or that recently broke up with their girlfriend. Anything we can talk about. If we're just randomly putting these people in the groups should end up being about the same on that variable. right? So even if there was 80% males in this original population, if we're randomly selecting, we should end up with two subgroups that each have about 80% male. Okay, and so we really use random selection to try to make sure that the only difference between these groups is the one we care about, which is their self-esteem. And we're going to create a high and a low self-esteem. Now, the book talks a little bit more about, okay, every now and then you don't totally want to rely on just random. If you thought, for example, that gender was important, then you might want to make sure that you have an equal number of males in both. And so in that case, you might pair up your males first and then say, okay, of you two males, now I'm going to randomly select. Okay, you go to the low group, you go to the high group. And now I'll take another pair of males or a pair of females. And now I know that I'm going to have the same number of males and females in both groups. You can do these sort of stratified sampling when you know something's important. Most of the time, we don't do that. Most of the time, we just randomly assign people to two different groups, and therefore those two groups should be equal on all variables that matter. Okay. What should be screaming in your head right now is, how the heck do you make somebody have a low or high self-esteem? And how the heck do you measure prejudice? Welcome to the world of operational definitions. And I think we go there next. Yes. So, an operational definition is between here and here on these slides. So we start off with something kind of vague and general. Do something to make them have a relatively high self-esteem. Whereas we're going to do something to these guys to make them have a relatively low self-esteem. Okay, so right now it's general at first. But in order to actually do the experiment, bring people in and do it, we have to figure out what this something is we're going to do. And so we have to now get specific about our manipulations, what we're going to manipulate, how we're going to manipulate it, and our measures, like prejudice. How are we going to measure it? So now that step is the step towards operational definitions, creating a specific experiment where you do certain things, but you're making assumptions as you do. So let's go here. Let's start with this. Self-esteem. I'm going to call this the control group, and I'm going to call this the experimental group, sort of lining up with the textbook. So imagine the study. Don't look at this for a second. Just imagine the study. You're a subject, you're a participant, and you're called into this room, and there's an experimenter there, and they're sitting with a table. Now, this is an actual experiment that happened. So the table was right in front of them, and they had a stack of slides. Now, most of you guys probably don't remember old school slides, but they were little things like about this big, and they would have pictures on them, and you could project them on the wall. And so back before PowerPoint and everything like that, people would create these slides, little photographs, each one of them a photograph essentially, and would project them one at a time in order on the slide while they were telling their story. So during the time of this study, that was how researchers shared their data, by slide presentations. And so this student now, this researcher, sitting behind the table, has the stack of slides. And what they say to you is, I'm really sorry I was a little late, but I have this presentation this afternoon of my research. It's very important. It's going to determine whether I can continue on or not. And I had to get these slides in just the right order, because if I screw anything up, that might be enough for them to kick me out of the program. So it took me a while to get all of this exactly like I like it. And I'm sorry that took a little bit, but cool, we're here now. So let's do our study. And so now, depending on which group you're in, one of two things happens. So the don't knock over is boring. So let's go over to the knockover. If you're in the experimental group, some point while you're talking to the experimenter and while the experimenter is giving you a sense of what's about to happen, they have a little thing they can touch with their knee that knocks the slides over. And so the slides knock over and fall onto the ground into a big mess. Okay, and the experimenter looks at that mess with shock and horror, like, oh my God. And then they look at you and they say, I can't believe you knocked over my slides. Oh my gosh. Do you know how much work Oh, and so they look totally stressed out. They look very accusational at you, and at some point they just say, whatever. Okay, let's just get this experiment done, and I'll worry about my slides later. Hey, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but let's just continue. And so the idea is they're trying to make you feel like crap for making their life bad, which should theoretically make you feel bad, make you feel like, oh man, I'm so stupid to do that. And so it should lower your self-esteem. The other group experiences the same thing, but we don't ever knock over the slides. The slides are there and they're kept fine. We never accuse this person of anything. And so here's our first objective operational definition. How are we going to create a group where these guys have a higher self-esteem than these guys? How are we going to manipulate self-esteem? Well, we're going to do it with this little slide trick, this knocking over of the slides, because we think the people that we do that to will feel a little stupid. They'll feel lower self-esteem. Okay, so that's our manipulation of self-esteem. What do we do after that? Well, what they did in this study is they had all the participants watch a video about French Canadians. Just a general information video about French Canadians. And then they gave them this survey that included attitudes about French Canadians. And some of the things in that survey were, essentially prejudicial messages, the kinds of attitudes people hold when they don't like French Canadians. And the question was, how much would people endorse these prejudicial attitudes? And so this was supposed to give us a measure of how prejudicial. So how much do you agree with the following point? And it might be something like French people dress funny. I don't know if French people dress better than English people by and large, but let me just say that, and you say, yes, I think that's true. They do dress funny. So would you endorse these sorts of things? And what they found in the study was when you did the knockover slides thing, the people that happened to would endorse these negative attitudes at a higher rate. Okay, we lowered their self-esteem, and that seemed to cause them to be more prejudicial. Okay, let's talk about the difference between a correlation here now. With a correlation, it would be people who naturally had higher or lower self-esteem, and that were naturally prejudicial or not. And so then we worry about things like third variables causing these two things to be connected. But if it's an experiment, we're starting with people who have whatever self-esteem they had, and now we've made them have low or high. And so now if suddenly we see a difference, it's what we did that's causing the difference. And what we did was try to reduce those students' self-esteem. So if we see more prejudice, we can be convinced that it was what we manipulated that caused that to happen. Okay. Let me just give you a couple of other examples. I'll just give you one other. I'll give you one other example of this operational definition and another one of this. So first of all, by the way, I should say this is what we're calling the independent variable. So the variable that we manipulate across our groups, the thing that makes those two groups different, that's our independent variable. And so one question is, how are we going to operationally define that? What are we going to do to create that difference? I talked about knocking over slides. Here's another example that people sometimes use for self-esteem. They have people do a test of a sort, let's say a math kind of test. So you work away and you do it, and then they look at your test. Now we have two different groups. For one group, the person looking at the test says something like, wow, you did pretty well in this test. You're pretty good at math, aren't you? This is something that you're kind of natural at, isn't it? And so they're saying sort of positive things about your math ability, and you're like, oh, cool, excellent. The other group, the person looks at it and goes, wow, you didn't do really good on that. The average is usually a lot higher than what you scored. You're not a real math kind of person, are you? This isn't really your thing. And so again, what they say to you had nothing to do with your actual score, right? It only is which group you got in. And for one group, they try to make them feel good about their performance. And another group, they try to make them not feel good about their performance. This is an example of a deception study, by the way, that was talked about. And so again, that could be another way of manipulating self-esteem. Why is that important? Well, Because if there are different ways of manipulating self-esteem, then each one becomes an option to test, an opportunity to test that general theory, right? If we can derive different ways of testing it and they all turn out to give us the same answer, then that's cool. Then that makes us feel like, yeah, that general theory is right. What about the attitudes or the prejudicial attitudes? You might be saying, well, these surveys, are people going to actually admit it? And sometimes they do. That studies seem to work. But there are also other ways to get at prejudicial attitudes. If you're interested in this, look up something called the implicit association test, IAT. And the idea here is, I'll give you a sense. People would sit in front of a computer. They're told, you know what, you're going to see a little bit of a flash, and then you're going to see the word good or bad. And you just have to press one button if it's good, a different button if it's bad. So you sit there and watch, wait for that word and say good or bad. But just before the word, they flash a face. And that face might be somebody from your cultural group or your racial group, let's say, or it might be somebody from an opposite racial group. And so let's say I'm a white guy and they're going to flash some black faces. Well, no, they flash white faces or black faces. Okay. And so this is, if I was highly prejudicial, this is what we might see against African Americans. This is what we might see. If there's a black face flashed really quickly and then the word good comes up, it takes me a long time to say that's the word good. Versus if a white face comes up and the word good comes up, I'm fast. If it's a black face and then the word bad, I'm really quick to say bad. But if it's a white face and then the word bad, I'm slower to respond bad. So I'm not being asked about my racial ideas at all. I'm just being asked to press good or bad as quick as I can. But if I associate African Americans with badness, then when I see one, I want to say bad. So if I have to say good, then I have to overcome that to say good. The more prejudicial I am, the longer it would take me to overcome that. Okay, so just show you, this is a clever operational way to measure the level of one's prejudicial attitude towards a specific group or gender or, you know, whatever you want that first stimulus to be. Kind of cool. It's part of the game of experiments, is getting good at coming up with these operational definitions, ways to manipulate things that matter, like self-esteem, ways to measure things that matter, like prejudice. Okay. All right. Last slide from all this. Oh, why is it bumping over the edges? I don't know why it's bumping over the edges, so let me just bring it in here. Okay, we'll just look at it this way. Doesn't matter. This will be fine. A few issues the textbook brings up about research and that I can connect to, I think, given, actually this just says related to. Let's just move this. Let's just move this whole thing over here. Okay, I'm gonna make a mess of everything now. I don't know why I felt the need to do this, but I did. Because of the animations. This will be fine. We'll do it this way. Okay, there we go. Back at it. Was the experiment performed well? So some of these experiments can have pretty major implications, right? When you're talking about things like prejudice, that affects a lot of people's life. And so we want to make sure we can trust research. We want to think critically about experiments and whether they actually provide the evidence they claim to provide for something. So there's different levels at which we ask questions. The first level is the experiment itself. Was the experiment performed well? So I say issues related to potential confounds and poor measurement. What's a confound? When we create our two groups, our control and our experimental groups, we want them to be identical except for that one thing that's different, self-esteem, let's say. But every now and then, people start to have worries that, no, there's something else different about your two groups too. So let's say, even though we did random selection, we ended up with more men in our low self-esteem group. Quite a few more men that ended up in the high self-esteem group. And now we show, okay, the low self-esteem group is showing more prejudice. Now the question is, Well, is that because of their low self-esteem or because there's more men in that group? That group is different in two ways. And so now we don't know which of those things is causing what we see. And so, that's a worry. And so you want to look very closely at an experiment to make sure that it really was done well and that only the critical variable was changed. You also really want to think about how they're defining things like prejudice. Let's say they used a survey for prejudice and then they found no effect. No, self-esteem doesn't change prejudice. You might want to say, yeah, but measuring prejudice with a survey doesn't make any sense, dude. I don't accept your result because I don't accept the way you measured something. And so somebody has to look very carefully at the details of how the experiment was done. Who looks at all of this stuff carefully? The person following up on a news report? No. We rely very heavily on something called peer review, and you're going to get a taste of this when you do your peer scholar activity. It will put you through the process. But the idea is this: if I write a paper, I describe experiments I've done and what I think they mean, and I submit that to a journal. That journal then sends it to at least 3 other professors like me who are interested in what I'm interested in, my same research thing. Those professors go through my research looking for any potential thing I did wrong, anything about my experiment that makes it untrustworthy. And if they find anything, they either insist that I fix it in a follow-up study or something like that, or they just say, don't publish this because we don't trust the data. It wasn't done well. And so they make recommendations to the editor, and based on their recommendations, the editor may decide not to publish at all, or give you a chance to fix some things, or maybe publish. So this is the internal way we try to make sure that our experiments are trustworthy, is by relying on peer review. Then there's this other question. Okay, within your study, you've shown that when you knock over slides and make someone feel bad that way, they show more prejudicial sort of behaviors. Okay, I guess. But let me think about what you did, knock over slides. You say it's low self-esteem. Maybe you just made people angry. Maybe by blaming them for knocking over slides when it was really you that knocked over the slides. Maybe they caught wind of that. They knew it was you, and they're just angry that you did. And what you're seeing is that angry people show more prejudicial behavior. So they're really saying, I'm not buying the way you manipulated self-esteem. I don't think it's true. So while your experiment was done well in the sense of what you did, I don't think it really supports your theory, your bigger theory. And that's external validity. That's how much do your results actually support what you say they do in that general sense. And that often depends on the validity of your operational definition. And so this is, remember I highlighted there's multiple ways to manipulate self-esteem. Often if you get a positive result with, creating that difference in one way, knocking over slides, you might want to redo the study, i.e. replicate, except use a different operational definition. Maybe that math test thing of self-esteem, creating high and low self-esteem. And so you use something else, and you, if you find the same result, like even when I do the math test way, then people are still more prejudicial when I hit their self-esteem. Then as you can show that with different specific operational definitions, then the general truth of what you're finding is supported. So we rely heavily on replication in psychology to really kind of gain trust for the data and the results we're getting. So have somebody else do that experiment. It's even better if somebody else does it, by the way. Somebody not so invested in the theory, let them try your experiment and maybe do some things a little differently. And if they still support that notion that low self-esteem is more prejudicial, then we start to really feel good about it. The other thing too is, by the way, we have so-called manipulation checks. We might just ask the participant at the end of the study, when I said you knocked over the slides, did you believe me? How did you feel? Did you feel stupid, or did you feel angry? And so these are called manipulation checks that, we assume a manipulation does something, But every now and then we might want to actually check if it's doing what we say it's doing. We might directly want to kind of, confirm that that did do what we thought it would do. And that's called manipulation checks. And, they can help us confirm, yes, that did make them feel stupid. It was self-esteem. And again, it relates back to the theory that way. This is a sort of more, it's something to be aware of. Are the findings only applicable to some specific group of humans? What we would love, really psychology is the psychology of human experience. However, most of the experiments that we've run involve Western, slightly above average IQ, mostly white, 19-year-old people, students. Mostly they involve intro psych students. Now, luckily, intro psych students have evolved significantly, so they are now much more multicultural and much more representative. But a lot of the research you're going to read about that was done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were done in American universities with mostly white students that were first year, so 18 years old, above average intelligence, because that's what it takes to get into university. You guys are above average intelligence. Excellent. And so one could literally ask, well, whatever you find, are you just learning about 18-year-old white people? And so what we want to try to do is get representative samples. We want to try to draw from a group of people that are the sort of people we want to make our inferences about. But we want to be aware that it's possible, if we did have to select from a more specific group of people, that we do so in a way that produces what we call representative samples. Or that we at least acknowledge that, okay, our results may only apply to this group. This is where randomness really comes in. If you're randomly pulling from all the people, then you can feel good that you have a good sample. But if any sort of bias sneaks in, then you don't feel good. And so let me just give you one example. Almost all medical research, was done only on males. Why? Females were often considered to be more fragile. They could be pregnant at a given time, so we can't test some drug and what effect it has. What if they're pregnant? What if they're a little more fragile and something we do, causes problems? And so early on in medical research, most of the research is done on healthy males. And so we've learned a whole lot about the medicine, physical medicine on healthy males. Females are different in a number of ways, and it's quite possible that issues are different for females. And so that's an example where we have to realize there is a bias in our selection and who we studied, and so therefore our results may not apply as generally as we like to think. We would love a good random sample of everybody. Okay, I've hit you with a bunch of things. And again, I intentionally hit you with these things. I know the textbook hits you with most of these things as well. So I just wanted you to have sort of two presentations, because I'd like you to come out of this chapter feeling like you know the scientific method, you understand experiments, you understand the role they play. And now when we start exposing you to experiments in intro psych, you will have a good ability to think about them critically and take from them what you will and debate what you will, because that's a big part of science, is not just accepting what you see but thinking about it critically. Alrighty, cool. I will leave this for here. I'm going to be back with a little video about stats, so I'll see you on that one. Okay, bye-bye.